What if I told you the Paris people fall in love with today isn't the real Paris at all? Beneath the cafés, the boulevards, the elegant cream-colored buildings, there's another city, buried 4 to 5 meters below your feet. A forgotten medieval world of fortress walls, lost rivers, cramped alleyways, and the streets so narrow 2 people could barely squeeze past each other. And the craziest part, most of it, is still down there. Because here's what almost nobody realizes about Paris. The city you see in movies, postcards, and Instagram photos is shockingly new. Most of modern Paris is barely 150 years old. Before that, the city looked completely different. Dense, chaotic, vertical, loud, filthy, and alive in a way that is almost impossible to imagine now. Then, in just 17 years, one man nearly erased all of it. Today, we're going to rebuild medieval Paris from the ground up, layer by layer from the riverbanks to the rooftops. And by the end of this video, you'll never look at Paris the same way again. So let us start with a thing that made Paris possible in the first place, the Seine. Today, the river looks controlled, civilized, stone embankments, smooth walkways, tourist boats gliding by on schedule. But medieval Paris, completely different story. Back then, the Seine was nearly twice as wide. There were no clean walls or orderly edges, just a sprawling, muddy waterway cutting through the landscape like an open wound. And feeding into it, on the left bank, was another river almost nobody talks about anymore, the Bièvre. That small river became the center of Paris's tanning industry. And if you know anything about medieval tanning, you already know how horrifying that must have smelled. Animal hides were soaked in mixtures of urine, bark, and even animal brains. So yes, the stench would have been absolutely unbearable. But as disgusting as that sounds, what was happening across the river was even more fascinating. Long before medieval Paris existed, the Romans had already figured out where the ideal settlement should be. They built their city, Lutetia, on the Montagne Sainte-Geneviève, a hill rising about 60 meters above the water. And the reason was brutally practical. The right bank was mostly swampland. The left bank hill was dry, elevated, defensible, and safe from flooding. But here's where things get really interesting. The roads the Romans built survived for more than 1,000 years. Their main north-south road, the Cardo Maximus, eventually became Rue Saint-Jacques. Across the river, it connected to Rue Saint-Denis. In other words, Roman infrastructure was still shaping medieval Paris. Long after the Roman Empire had collapsed, people were literally walking through the skeleton of an ancient civilization without even realizing it. Those roads linked monasteries on the hills to the growing commercial districts clustered around the riverbanks below. And this is where Paris starts transforming into something extraordinary. The year is 1190. King Philip Augustus is preparing to leave for the Third Crusade. He's about to sail to the Holy Land, and he's terrified because while he is gone, England could attack Paris. So he makes a radical decision. He orders the construction of an enormous stone wall around the entire city. And this wasn't just a defensive barrier. It was one of the most ambitious urban engineering projects Europe had ever seen. The wall enclosed 253 hectares. On the left bank alone, it stretched 2,500 meters, stood 6 to 8 meters high, and was 3 meters thick at the base. The right bank section was even larger. 77 towers rose above the walls like giant stone teeth, each around 15 meters tall and spaced every 60 meters apart. And guarding the Seine were 4 massive river towers, connected by enormous iron chains stretched across the water to block enemy ships. Pretty incredible for the 12th century. But the most important detail is something most people completely overlook. Philip Augustus intentionally enclosed far more land than Paris actually needed. Fields, vineyards, empty space. And he did it on purpose, because he understood something shockingly modern. If you restrict outward expansion, the city is forced to grow upward. He created pressure. As the population exploded during the medieval warming period, buildings became taller, denser, and more compact. Timber houses slowly gave way to multi-story stone buildings. Medieval Paris began stacking itself vertically. And this project was so massive, it consumed roughly 12% of the entire royal annual budget. Now, here's the wild part. Traces of that wall still exist today. On Rue des Jardins Saint-Paul, a surviving section of Philip Augustus's wall still stands beside a modern children's playground. But if you look carefully, the playground sits noticeably lower than the surrounding streets. That lower ground level, that's medieval Paris. The modern city has literally risen on top of the old one through centuries of rebuilding, demolition, ash, mud, and debris. Once you understand the wall, the rest of the city suddenly starts making sense, because medieval Paris revolved around 2 massive centers of power. On one side, the Louvre, not the museum, not the glass pyramid, a fortress, a brutal military stronghold built at the weakest point of the Western defenses. At its center stood a giant cylindrical keep, 30 meters tall with walls 4 meters thick, surrounded by moats and defensive barriers. It wasn't designed to welcome people. It was designed to terrify them. But over time, something fascinating happened. By the 14th century, that harsh fortress slowly transformed into a palace. Charles V hired architect Raymond du Temple to carve more than 100 windows into the heaviest stone walls, add decorative towers and chimneys, and crown the structure with blue slate roofs. The royal library was even moved inside. And that transformation tells you everything about medieval Paris itself. The city was constantly reinventing itself. Meanwhile, across the city on the Ile de la Cité, another center of power dominated the skyline, the Palais de la Cité. This was the administrative heart of France. Inside stood one of the largest halls in medieval Europe, a massive Gothic chamber stretching more than 60 meters long, and nearby Louis IX built Sainte-Chapelle to house what he believed were the actual relics of Christ's Passion. That chapel pushed Gothic engineering to its absolute limits. Hidden metal reinforcements allowed enormous stained glass windows to flood the interior with colored light in ways that must have felt almost supernatural to medieval worshippers. And then, in 1350, something revolutionary appeared on the palace's northern tower, Paris's first public mechanical clock. For the first time, an entire city could look up and share the same sense of time. But this is where the story takes another turn. The Ile de la Cité you see today, open, spacious, almost ceremonial, looked nothing like its medieval version. Back then, the island was packed tight, 43 narrow winding streets, houses jammed shoulder to shoulder, Workshops, churches, shops, and thousands of residents compressed into a maze of timber and stone. Even the square in front of Notre-Dame was dramatically smaller, barely 1/10 the size it is today. And incredibly, it sat 4 to 5 meters lower than the modern plaza. The medieval riverbank actually cut through what is now open space. That tiny square was constantly crowded with pilgrims, merchants, criminals awaiting public confession before execution, and travelers measuring distances from an ancient pre-Roman marker stone known as Monsieur Le Gris, Mr. Gray. Now, most people assume medieval Paris was powered by religion or royalty, but the true engine of the city was commerce, and commerce belonged to the right bank. By the 15th century, the Seine had evolved into a fully specialized economic machine. Separate docks handled wine, grain, fish, plaster, paving stones, firewood, and construction timber. Every dock supported its own guilds, merchants, and labor networks. Entire neighborhoods revolved around single industries. And at the center of it all, Sought Lige Hall. What started as a small textile market near a cemetery exploded into the largest food market in Paris. Fish halls, butter stalls, cheese vendors, garlic merchants, egg sellers. By the 15th century, Les Halles effectively controlled food prices across the entire city. But now we need to address one of the biggest myths about medieval cities, and this might surprise you. The idea that medieval Paris was just one giant open sewer, that's actually misleading. Archaeological evidence shows the city had surprisingly organized waste systems. Private latrines were built above brick-lined cesspits. Property owners needed permits to operate them. Specialized night workers, known as gong farmers, emptied the pits after dark to reduce the smell. One worker would climb down into the filth while others loaded the waste into sealed barrels. The contents were transported by river barge and sold outside the city as fertilizer. Even urine was collected separately and sold to textile dyers and tanners. Was the city still filthy? Absolutely. The population had simply outgrown the infrastructure. Open drains overflowed with butchered animal blood, household waste, and toxic runoff from the tanneries along the Bièvre. And then, in 1370, Paris built its first underground sewer beneath Rue Montmartre. There was just one problem. The engineer forgot maintenance access. The sewer repeatedly clogged and collapsed. The smell became so unbearable that the king eventually abandoned his own palace in the Marais district just to escape it. And then there were the streets themselves. Dark, narrow, dangerous. During the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War in 1418, more than 500 men were killed in a street fighting in a single day. The alleyways became death traps. Sharp corners made ambushes easy. Barricades could be built in minutes using furniture, paving stones, and timber beams. And that exact problem is what eventually doomed medieval Paris. Because between 1853 and 1870, Baron Haussmann, working under Napoleon III, systematically tore the old city apart. Officially, it was about sanitation, cholera prevention, modern plumbing, but unofficially, it was about control. Between 1830 and 1848, Paris experienced 7 major uprisings. Revolutionaries had repeatedly weaponized the medieval streets against the government. Every narrow alley was a fortress waiting to happen. Haussmann's wide boulevards weren't just beautiful, they were military infrastructure. Straight roads allowed cavalry and artillery to move quickly through the city. Barricades became far harder to build effectively. The redesign was anti-revolutionary by design, and the scale of destruction was staggering. Roughly 20,000 historic buildings demolished, 100,000 apartments erased, entire working-class neighborhoods wiped off the map. On the Ile de la Cité alone, more than 25,000 residents were displaced. And with that, the old medieval social structure collapsed too. Wealthy families and laborers no longer lived side by side. The rich concentrated in the center while workers were pushed outward toward districts like Belleville. And that divide still shapes Paris today. But here's the twist: almost nobody knows medieval Paris never fully disappeared. In the 1960s, construction workers building an underground parking garage beneath the Notre-Dame Plaza accidentally uncovered something extraordinary: Roman walls, ancient heating systems, foundations of medieval houses, entire layers of buried Paris preserved beneath the modern city. Today, that site is the archaeological crypt of the Ile de la Cité, where you can literally walk through medieval ground level, while modern Paris moves above your head. And now, technology is bringing the lost city back in ways nobody expected. In 2015, art historian Andrew Talon laser-scanned Notre-Dame from 50 different positions, capturing over 1 billion precise measurements of the cathedral. Then came the devastating fire in 2019. Those scans became one of the most important blueprints for restoration. But researchers are now doing something even more remarkable. Using light simulations and acoustic modeling, they are reconstructing what medieval Notre-Dame actually felt like in the 13th century. How sunlight moved through the original stained glass, how voices echoed beneath the vaults, how the cathedral sounded when filled with worshippers 800 years ago. So no, the real Paris was never truly lost. It's buried beneath the streets, hidden inside archaeological layers, preserved in laser scans and digital reconstructions. And the elegant city millions of tourists walk through every year, that's just the newest layer, a polished surface built on top of something older, stranger, darker, and far more alive than most people realize. So the next time you see Paris, whether in person or just in a photograph, remember this: beneath every boulevard, every cafe, every stone building, there's another city hiding underneath. A city of fortress walls, forgotten rivers, buried houses, and millions of lives erased from the surface, but never completely gone. And once you see Paris this way, you can't unsee it.